2002, 7-year-old Danielle van Dam vanished from the bedroom of her Sabre Springs home. She was found murdered weeks later, and today she would have celebrated her 21st birthday.
There was convincing forensic evidence. Danielle's blood on Westerfield's jacket and inside his motorhome. Hair, fingerprints, fibers on the girl's body.
Title cause determined that the penalty shall be death.
When the guilty verdict was read, cheers on the steps of the downtown courthouse.
On the night of February 1, 2002, in a quiet neighborhood of San Diego, a 7-year-old girl was put to bed by her father as usual. Hours later, when her mother returned, the home's alarm system flashed and a door was left ajar. The next morning, the girl's room was empty. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. The community quickly became alert. Hundreds joined the search. The investigation lasted for weeks and relied heavily on scientific evidence to find answers. This is the story of a fateful night and the power of science in uncovering the truth.
On the evening of February 1st, 2002, in the quiet neighborhood of Sabre Springs in San Diego, Danielle van Dam followed his usual nighttime routine. Around 10:30 p.m., he tucked his 7-year-old daughter Danielle into bed. The house was calm, and the children were settled for the night. Later that evening, Brenda van Dam went out with friends. She returned home shortly after 2 a.m., accompanied by several people. As they entered the house, Brenda noticed that the security alarm was flashing. She discovered that the side door leading to the garage was open. The group closed the door and continued talking for about half an hour before the visitors left. After everyone had gone, Damon and Brenda went to bed. However, around 3 a.m., Damon woke up again. He saw that the alarm light was flashing once more. This time, he found the sliding glass door at the back of the house slightly open. He closed it and returned to bed without checking the children's rooms. The next morning, on February 2nd, Brenda went upstairs to wake Danielle. When she entered the bedroom, she found the bed empty. Danielle was not in her room, and there was no sign of her anywhere in the house. Brenda quickly searched the home and the yard, but could not find her daughter. At 9:39 a.m., the family called the police to report that Danielle was missing. What had started as an ordinary night had now become something far more serious. The moment the call was made, the situation changed completely. As one family member later recalled in a statement to the media, "We called the police right away. That was the moment everything changed." In the hours that followed, police officers arrived at the home and began examining the scene. They noted the 2 instances when the security alarm had been triggered during the night. They also observed that the side garage door and the sliding glass door had both been found open at different times. These small but unusual details were recorded carefully as the investigation started to take shape. The family explained the sequence of events from the previous night in detail. They described how the alarm had flashed twice and how the doors had been discovered open. Although nothing appeared to be missing or damaged inside the house, the fact that Danielle was no longer in her room raised immediate concern. Police began speaking with neighbors and asking questions about anything unusual that might have been noticed during the night. At the same time, they started to piece together a timeline of the family's movements from the evening before. Every detail, no matter how small, was considered important.
I can't believe that it's happened this close to home.
In 2002, 7-year-old Danielle van Dam vanished from the bedroom of her Sabre Springs home. She was found murdered weeks later, and today she would have celebrated her 21st birthday.
By midday, the search for Danielle had already begun to expand beyond the immediate area. Officers coordinated with local resources, and plans were made to check nearby locations. The community was also beginning to hear about the situation, and offers of help started to come in. What made the early stage of the investigation particularly challenging was the lack of clear signs of forced entry or disturbance inside the home. The doors had been found open, but there were no broken locks or windows. This detail led investigators to consider multiple possibilities as they worked to understand how Danielle could have left the house without anyone noticing. Throughout the day, Damon and Brenda remained at the house, speaking with police and trying to recall every moment from the night before. They repeated the timeline of Brenda's return. The flashing alarm, and Damon closing the sliding door in the early morning hours. Every piece of information was shared in the hope that it might help locate Danielle quickly. By the afternoon of February 2nd, the case had already drawn significant attention from local law enforcement. Resources were being organized, and the search efforts were expanding. What had begun with 2 small incidents, involving an alarm and open doors, had now become a full-scale effort to find a missing child. The events of that night, the alarm flashing twice, the doors being found open, and the discovery the next morning would remain central to the investigation in the days ahead. Each detail, however ordinary it seemed at the time, would later be examined closely as part of the larger effort to understand exactly what had happened between the evening of February 1st and the morning of February 1st and the morning of February 2nd.
Today marks 20 years since the kidnapping and murder of Danielle van Dam. The 7-year-old girl was taken from her bedroom at night.
By mid-morning on February 2nd, 2002, police officers had already arrived at the Van Dam home in Sabre Springs. After speaking with the family and examining the house, they quickly determined that this was not a typical missing child case. The circumstances, a young child disappearing from her bedroom overnight with no clear explanation, led authorities to treat the situation with the highest level of urgency. A command center was soon established to coordinate the search efforts, with assistance from the Laurel Recovery Center, a nonprofit organization experienced in missing persons cases. Police organized a structured response. The center helped manage logistics, volunteer coordination, and communication between law enforcement and the community. This collaboration allowed search teams to be deployed efficiently across a wide area. Within hours, hundreds of volunteers had joined the effort. People from the local community and surrounding neighborhoods came forward to help. Search parties were sent into nearby canyons, open fields, and along major roads and highways. The scale of the operation grew rapidly as more individuals offered their time and resources. Some volunteers walked through difficult terrain, while others assisted with organizing supplies and relaying information back to the command center. The strong response from the community reflected how deeply the disappearance affected the area. In a neighborhood long considered safe and quiet, the news that a child had gone missing from her own home created widespread concern. Many residents felt compelled to take action, believing that every possible effort should be made to locate Danielle as quickly as possible. The large number of volunteers demonstrated both the fear and the sense of responsibility felt by those living nearby. Former San Diego County District Attorney Paul Piefingst later reflected on the unusual nature of the case. In a statement to the media, he said, "I have never seen a case where someone entered a home and took a child out of bed in the middle of the night like that." As the search continued throughout the day, police maintained close communication with the family. Officers continued to gather details about the previous night, including the 2 times the security alarm had been triggered and the doors that had been found open. These details were carefully documented and shared with the teams conducting the search. The involvement of the Laurel Recovery Center proved valuable in keeping the operation organized. The organization helped ensure that volunteers were properly briefed and that search areas were covered systematically. This level of coordination was important because the terrain around Sabre Springs included both residential zones and more remote canyons, making a structured approach necessary. By the end of the first day, the search had expanded significantly. What had begun as a response from local police had grown into a large-scale community effort. The participation of so many volunteers highlighted how seriously the disappearance was being taken. It also showed the willingness of people in the area to come together when a child was unaccounted for. Throughout the following days, the command center remained active. New search areas were added as investigators followed up on tips and leads. Volunteers continued to show up, and the operation maintained its intensity. The early decision to treat the case as urgent and to involve experienced organizations like the Laurel Recovery Center helped create a foundation for the extensive search that would continue in the weeks ahead. The events of February 2nd marked the beginning of a sustained effort that would draw in law enforcement, volunteers, and community members alike. The disappearance of a child from her bedroom had prompted an immediate and organized response, one that reflected both the seriousness of the situation and the collective concern of those determined to find answers. As the search for Danielle continued on February 2nd, 2002, police officers began speaking with neighbors in the Sabre Springs area. They asked routine questions about anything unusual that might have been noticed during the night or early morning. One of the people they spoke with lived just 2 houses away from the Van Dam family. His name was David Westerfield. Investigators quickly learned that Westerfield had not been at his home on the morning of February 2nd. Instead, he had left early, driving his recreational vehicle, or RV. According to records and witness accounts, he first traveled to a beach area before heading toward the desert. His movements that day were later confirmed through gas receipts, cell phone records, and statements from people who saw him. The following day, on February 3rd, Westerfield took several items to a dry cleaning service. Among the items were a jacket, comforters, and pillow covers. This action was later noted by investigators as part of the timeline they were building. At the time, however, it was simply one of the details being collected as police tried to understand the movements of everyone in the immediate area. What stood out to investigators was the combination of Westerfield's early departure on the morning Danielle was reported missing and his extensive travel that day. Leaving home in an RV so soon after a child had disappeared from a nearby house drew attention. His route first to the beach and then to the desert also raised questions because it seemed unplanned and covered a significant distance in a short period of time. A witness who lived in the neighborhood later recalled seeing Westerfield leave early that morning. In statements given to the media, the witness noted, "He left the house very early that day, just minutes after the family reported the child missing."
There was convincing forensic evidence: Danielle's blood on Westerfield's jacket and inside his motorhome, hair, fingerprints, fibers on the girl's body.
Police continued to gather information about Westerfield's activities. They spoke with people who had seen him at different locations during his travels. They also looked into his background as a longtime resident of the area. Although he had no prior criminal record, the timing and nature of his movements on February 2nd made him a person of interest in the early stages of the investigation. Investigators paid particular attention to the fact that Westerfield had access to an RV, which could be used to travel long distances. They also noted that he had returned home and then taken items to be cleaned the next day. These actions, while not immediately conclusive, were documented as part of the growing file on the case. As more information was collected, the focus on Westerfield gradually increased. His absence from home at a critical time, combined with his decision to travel extensively on the day Danielle went missing, set him apart from other neighbors who were interviewed. Police began to examine his story more closely, comparing the details he provided with the timeline established by other witnesses and records. The early attention given to Westerfield was based on observable facts rather than speculation. His movements on February 2nd and 3 were verifiable through multiple sources, including receipts and eyewitness accounts. These details became part of the broader investigation as authorities worked to determine whether his actions were connected to the disappearance. By the end of the first few days, Westerfield had become a central figure in the inquiry. While the search for Danielle continued in the surrounding areas, investigators were also building a clearer picture of his activities during the critical hours after she was last seen. The combination of his early departure, his travel route, and the items he later took to be cleaned remained points of interest as the case progressed.
Body. Sabre Springs neighbor David Westerfield had already been arraigned in court on kidnapping and murder charges.
As the investigation progressed in the days following February 2002, police began to focus more closely on David Westerfield. After gathering information about his movements and speaking with people who knew him, investigators decided to examine his home and recreational vehicle. A search warrant was obtained, and officers carefully went through both the house and the RV. During the search, several items of interest were collected. Small traces of blood were found on a jacket and on the floor inside the RV. Hairs that appeared consistent with those of a child were also located in different areas of the vehicle. In addition, fibers and fingerprints were recovered from various surfaces. These findings were documented and secured according to standard procedures for handling potential evidence. All of the items collected during the search were sent to a forensic laboratory for detailed analysis. Laboratory technicians began the process of examining the blood, hairs, fibers, and fingerprints to determine whether they could be linked to Danielle or to the Van Dam home. This stage marked a shift in the investigation, as scientific testing started to play a more central role in connecting different pieces of information. The discovery of these traces was significant because it provided investigators with physical material that could be studied objectively. While witness statements and timelines were important, the forensic evidence offered a different type of information, one that could be measured and compared through scientific methods. The process of sending the items to the lab and waiting for results became a key part of building the case. Former San Diego County District Attorney Paul Pfingst later commented on the importance of this type of evidence. In a statement reflecting on the investigation, he noted, "Scientific evidence told us a great deal. These were small details, but they carried significant weight." As the laboratory work continued, investigators maintained their focus on other aspects of the case as well. They continued to interview people and review records related to Westerfield's activities in the days before and after Danielle was reported missing. However, the forensic findings from the search of his property remained an important part of the overall picture. The examination of the RV was particularly detailed because it had been used for travel during the critical time period. Technicians looked for any materials that might connect the vehicle to the Van Dam residence or to Danielle herself. The combination of blood traces, hairs, fibers, and fingerprints created multiple points that could be analyzed and compared. This phase of the investigation highlighted how forensic science can turn seemingly minor findings into meaningful evidence. A single hair or a small fiber might not appear important at first glance, but when examined in a laboratory and compared with known samples, it can help establish connections between people, places, and objects. In this case, the items recovered from Westerfield's home and RV were subjected to careful scientific review. The process of collecting and analyzing evidence took time. As laboratory work requires precision and thorough documentation, investigators understood that the results would need to be reliable if they were to be used later in any legal proceedings. Throughout this period, the search for Danielle continued, while the forensic examination of the collected items moved forward steadily. By focusing on both the physical evidence and the timeline of events, investigators were able to develop a more complete understanding of the case. The decision to thoroughly search Westerfield's property and send the findings for laboratory analysis represented an important step in the investigation. It showed how scientific methods were being applied to examine the small, but potentially significant details that had been discovered. After the items collected from David Westerfield's home and recreational vehicle were sent to the laboratory, the results of the scientific analysis began to come back. One of the most significant findings was the presence of blood that matched Danielle's. This blood was found on a jacket belonging to Westerfield, as well as on the floor inside his RV. In addition, hairs that were consistent with Danielle's were also recovered from the vehicle. Laboratory technicians also examined fibers that had been collected. Some of these fibers matched those found in Danielle's bedroom. These fibers were located both in Westerfield's house and inside the RV. The presence of matching fibers at multiple locations helped investigators connect different pieces of physical evidence to the same source. Fingerprints were another important part of the forensic results. Prints that were identified as belonging to Danielle were found inside the RV. Other trace materials were also examined and compared with known samples from the Van Dam home. As the laboratory work continued, a pattern began to emerge from the different types of evidence that had been collected. The combination of blood, hair, fibers, and fingerprints created a set of findings that pointed in a consistent direction. Although each piece of evidence on its own might have been considered limited, when viewed together they formed a clearer picture. Investigators noted that the evidence was indirect in nature, but showed a strong pattern of connection between Westerfield's property and Danielle. A statement from one of the investigative reports summarized the situation clearly. The traces were found in multiple different locations, and they all pointed in the same direction. This consistency across different types of evidence was important for the investigation. Blood and hair provided biological links, while fibers offered a connection between the two locations. Fingerprints added another layer of identification. When these different categories of evidence were considered as a whole, they helped build a more complete understanding of the movements and contacts that had taken place. Investigators paid close attention to the fact that the evidence was not limited to a single item or a single location. The presence of matching materials in both the house and the RV suggested that there had been contact or transfer between these places and the Van Dam residence. This multi-source approach strengthened the overall value of the forensic findings. The laboratory process also involved careful comparison with control samples. Technicians used known materials from Danielle's room and from the family's home to verify the matches. This step was essential to ensure the accuracy of the results before they could be used further in the investigation. As more results were confirmed, the focus of the case began to narrow. The scientific evidence provided investigators with objective data that could be documented and presented clearly. While witness statements and timelines remained important, the forensic findings offered a different kind of support, one based on physical traces that could be examined and verified through established scientific methods. The results from the laboratory did not immediately conclude the investigation, but they significantly advanced it. The blood, hair, fibers, and fingerprints together created a body of evidence that required explanation. This stage marked a turning point where scientific analysis moved from the collection of samples to the interpretation of meaningful connections. By the time the key forensic results were fully reviewed, investigators had a more defined direction to pursue. The consistent pattern across multiple types of evidence helped guide the next steps in the case. This careful, evidence-based approach would continue to shape the investigation as it moved forward. On February 23, 2002, David Westerfield was arrested. By this point, investigators had gathered a significant amount of information and physical evidence related to the disappearance of Danielle van Dam. The decision to make the arrest came after weeks of searching, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing forensic findings from Westerfield's home and recreational vehicle. Following the arrest, police publicly shared some of the key evidence they had collected. This included the presence of blood and hairs that were consistent with Danielle, as well as fibers and fingerprints recovered from Westerfield's property. While not all details were released at the time, the information that was made public showed that the investigation had moved from the search phase into a more focused stage of building a case. The arrest marked an important development in the timeline of the investigation. It came after careful review of the evidence gathered during the search of Westerfield's house and RV. Investigators had worked to ensure that all materials were collected, documented, and preserved according to proper forensic procedures. This careful handling of evidence was essential in preparing the case for any future legal proceedings. One of the statements released during this period noted that the evidence collected had reached a point where it supported moving forward with the arrest and continuing the investigation. As described in news reports at the time, the evidence was sufficient to proceed with the arrest and continue the investigation. The process of gathering and preserving scientific evidence played a central role in strengthening the case. From the initial search of the property to the laboratory analysis of blood, hairs, fibers, and fingerprints, each step had been carried out with attention to detail. Proper documentation and chain of custody helped ensure that the evidence could be relied upon as the investigation progressed. Investigators continued to review all available information, including witness statements, timelines, and the forensic results. The combination of these elements allowed them to build a more complete picture of the events surrounding Danielle's disappearance. The careful work done during this phase helped create a foundation that could be presented clearly in court later on. As the case moved forward, the focus shifted from active searching to organizing and preparing the evidence that had been collected. Police worked closely with forensic experts to interpret the laboratory findings and understand how they connected to the overall timeline. This stage required both scientific analysis and careful coordination between different parts of the investigation team. The decision to arrest Westerfield on February 22 was based on the evidence available at that time. It did not mark the end of the investigation but rather a transition into the next phase, where the collected materials would be further examined and organized for legal proceedings. Throughout this period, investigators maintained their commitment to following proper procedures in handling all evidence. By preserving the integrity of the physical evidence and documenting each step of the process, the investigation team helped ensure that the case was built on a solid foundation. This careful approach to evidence management would prove important as the case moved closer to the trial stage. The work done between the arrest and the beginning of formal court proceedings focused on organizing the information and scientific findings into a clear and coherent presentation. The period following the arrest represented a critical stage in which the investigation transitioned from fact-finding to case preparation. The evidence that had been collected and analyzed with care now formed the basis for the next steps in the legal process. The trial of David Westerfield began in June 2002 and lasted for 2 months. It took place in a San Diego courtroom and drew significant public attention due to the nature of the case. From the beginning, the prosecution focused on presenting the evidence in a clear and organized manner, with particular emphasis on the forensic findings that had been collected during the investigation. The prosecutor methodically laid out the chain of forensic evidence for the jury. This included the blood found on Westerfield's jacket and inside his recreational vehicle, hairs that were consistent with Danielle's, fibers matching those from her bedroom, and fingerprints recovered from the RV. Each piece of evidence was introduced with supporting documentation from the laboratory analysis. The goal was to show how these different traces connected Westerfield's property to Danielle and to the Van Dam home. One of the key points emphasized by the prosecution was the consistency of the evidence across multiple locations. Traces were not limited to a single place. Instead, matching materials were found in both Westerfield's house and his RV, as well as in areas connected to the Van Dam residence. This pattern of consistency was presented as an important factor in understanding the overall case. Rather than relying heavily on speculation or alternative theories, the prosecution centered its argument on the scientific evidence. The forensic results were presented as objective data that had been examined through established laboratory procedures. By focusing on the physical evidence and its connections, the prosecution aimed to build a case based on measurable findings rather than assumptions. Throughout the trial, expert witnesses were called to explain the laboratory processes and the significance of the matches that had been identified. These experts helped the jury understand how blood, hair, fibers, and fingerprints are analyzed and compared. The systematic presentation allowed the jury to follow the development of the evidence from the time it was collected to the final laboratory conclusions. The prosecution also highlighted the careful documentation and preservation of the evidence. This was important to demonstrate that the materials had been handled properly from the moment they were recovered. By showing the reliability of the forensic process, the prosecution sought to establish that the evidence could be trusted as part of the overall case. As the trial progressed over the 2-month period, the jury heard detailed testimony about each category of evidence. The focus remained on the connections between the different locations and the consistency of the findings. This approach allowed the prosecution to present a structured narrative based on the scientific work that had been done during the investigation. If you are following this case and want to continue learning about how the evidence was presented in court, please consider subscribing to the channel. New videos are released regularly with detailed breakdowns of important trials and investigations. I would also like to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the way the forensic evidence was presented? Feel free to share your comments below. By the time the prosecution completed its presentation, the jury had been given a detailed overview of the scientific evidence collected in the case. The emphasis on consistency and proper forensic procedures formed the foundation of the argument that was put forward during the trial. As the trial continued, the defense team began to present its case. Rather than accepting the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence, the defense attorneys raised questions about several key details. They also offered alternative explanations for how some of the traces might have appeared in Westerfield's home and recreational vehicle. Their approach focused on creating reasonable doubt by challenging the strength and meaning of the scientific findings. One of the main areas of debate concerned the timing of events. The defense paid particular attention to the forensic entomology evidence, which involved the study of insects found on and around the body. By presenting testimony from their own experts, the defense argued that the timing suggested by the prosecution's entomologists might not be accurate. They proposed that the body could have been placed at the discovery location at a later time than the prosecution claimed. This disagreement over entomology became one of the most technical parts of the trial. Both sides called expert witnesses who had different opinions about when insect activity would have begun. The defense used these differences to suggest that the timeline presented by the prosecution was not certain. They argued that if the timing was uncertain, then other aspects of the case might also be open to different interpretations. Beyond the entomology evidence, the defense also questioned how some of the other traces, such as fibers and hairs, could have ended up in Westerfield's RV and home. They offered possible explanations involving secondary transfer or contamination, suggesting that the presence of these materials did not necessarily prove direct contact at the time of the disappearance. Through cross-examination of the prosecution's experts, the defense attempted to show that scientific evidence can sometimes be interpreted in more than one way. The trial became a clear example of how two sides can examine the same scientific data and reach different conclusions. While the prosecution presented the evidence as a consistent pattern pointing in one direction, the defense worked to show that the same evidence could support other possibilities. This back and forth over the meaning and reliability of forensic findings turned the courtroom into a place where the interpretation of science was actively debated. Throughout this phase, both the prosecution and the defense relied on expert testimony to support their positions. The jury was asked to consider complex scientific concepts, including how insect development can be used to estimate time of death and how trace materials can move between locations. The detailed questioning of experts on both sides highlighted the challenges of using scientific evidence in a legal setting, where absolute certainty is often difficult to achieve. The defense's strategy was not to deny the existence of the evidence, but to question how it should be understood. By focusing on issues such as timing, possible contamination, and alternative explanations, they aimed to create enough uncertainty in the minds of the jurors. This approach made the scientific debate one of the central elements of the trial. As the presentation of evidence from both sides came to an end, the jury was left with two different interpretations of the same forensic findings. The prosecution maintained that the evidence formed a clear and consistent picture, while the defense argued that important questions remained unanswered. This contrast in how the scientific evidence was presented and challenged would later play a significant role in the jury's deliberations. After nearly 2 months of testimony and evidence presentation, the jury began its deliberations in August 2002. On August 21, 2002, the jury reached a verdict. David Westerfield was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The jury also found him guilty of possessing child pornography, a charge that had been added during the investigation. The verdict came after the jury carefully reviewed the forensic evidence and witness testimony presented throughout the trial. Following the guilty verdict, the case moved into the penalty phase. In this stage, the jury was asked to decide whether Westerfield should receive the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. After hearing additional arguments and evidence related to sentencing, the jury recommended the death penalty. On January 3, 2003, the judge formally sentenced David Westerfield to death. The sentencing marked the beginning of a long legal process. Like most death penalty cases in California, the verdict and sentence were subject to automatic appeals. Westerfield's legal team filed multiple appeals over the years, challenging various aspects of the trial, including the handling of evidence and the jury's decisions. These appeals moved through the California court system over more than a decade. In 2019, the California Supreme Court issued its final ruling on the case. The court reviewed the entire record and unanimously upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. The justices found that there were no legal errors serious enough to overturn the jury's verdict or the sentencing decision. This ruling effectively ended the direct appeal process for Westerfield.
Title cause determined that the penalty shall be death.
When a jury found David Westerfield guilty of kidnapping and murdering 7-year-old Danielle van Dam in 2002, crowds cheered outside the downtown courthouse.
Even after the Supreme Court decision, Westerfield remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison. However, significant changes in California's death penalty system affected his situation. In 2006, California placed a moratorium on executions, meaning no death row inmates were being executed. This policy remained in place in the following years. In March 2024, David Westerfield was transferred out of death row. He was moved from San Quentin to High Desert State Prison in Susanville, California, and placed in the general prison population. This transfer was part of a broader state program that relocates condemned inmates to other facilities. The program allows these inmates to participate in certain programs while still serving their sentences. Despite the transfer, Westerfield's death sentence remains legally in effect. The legal journey in this case stretched more than 2 decades from the time of the verdict to the 2024 transfer. During this period, the case moved through multiple levels of review, including trial, sentencing, and appeals up to the state's highest court. The long process reflects the complex nature of death penalty cases in California, where extensive legal safeguards are built into the system. Throughout these years, the victim's family and the broader community continued to follow developments in the case. While the legal proceedings moved slowly through the courts, the original trial and the evidence presented remained the foundation of the conviction. The 2019 Supreme Court decision and the 2024 transfer represented the most recent major updates in a case that has now spanned more than 20 years. As of 2026, David Westerfield continues to serve his sentence in prison. His legal options for further appeals have been significantly limited following the California Supreme Court's ruling. The case stands as an example of how death penalty cases in California can involve extended periods of litigation, even after a jury has reached a verdict. More than 2 decades have passed since February 2002, yet the case of Danielle van Dam continues to be remembered and discussed. Throughout these years, the Van Dam family has chosen to focus on honoring Danielle's memory in a positive way. They have taken part in memorial activities, supported community efforts.
After the trial, people built a wooden staircase at the location where Danielle's body was found so they could leave photos and flowers. The Van Dam family released a music video tribute.
And quietly worked to spread messages of awareness. Instead of allowing the tragedy to define them, the family has emphasized remembrance, kindness, and the importance of protecting children in daily life. Their continued efforts show a commitment to turning a painful experience into something that can benefit others.
I don't want to think about him. No. Today is Danielle's 21st birthday, and we've always celebrated on her birthday and celebrated her life. It's emotional. I avoid this place. Yeah. But today, having it here, speaking to you here today in the park, there's a tree that her brownie troop planted for her years ago.
One of the clearest lessons from this case is the importance of basic home security. The events of that night highlighted how small oversights can create serious risks. Doors that were left unlocked, an alarm system that was not fully activated, and the decision not to check on the children after noticing the open doors all played a role in the situation. While it is impossible to eliminate every risk, this case showed that simple and consistent habits, such as securing doors and windows before going to bed, can make a real difference. Many people who followed the case have since become more careful about these basic safety measures in their own homes. Another significant lesson lies in the power of forensic science. This case demonstrated how physical evidence, when carefully collected and properly analyzed, can help uncover the truth even in the absence of direct witnesses. The blood, hairs, fibers, and fingerprints that were examined in the laboratory became central to connecting the different parts of the investigation. The case showed that scientific evidence, when gathered and preserved correctly, can provide objective information that stands up to scrutiny. It also highlighted the importance of having trained experts who can explain complex findings to a jury in a clear and understandable way. The long legal process that followed the verdict also offers important lessons. From the guilty verdict in August 2002 to the California Supreme Court's decision in 2019, and the transfer of Westerfield in 2024, the case moved through many stages of review. This extended timeline reminded the public that justice, especially in serious cases, often requires patience. The legal system includes multiple layers of review to ensure that convictions are based on solid evidence. While the process can be slow, it also reflects the seriousness with which such cases are treated. Even after more than 20 years, this case continues to serve as a reminder of several important values. It shows the importance of community involvement when a child goes missing, as seen in the large number of volunteers who joined the search. It also demonstrates how forensic science can bring clarity when other forms of evidence are limited. Most importantly, it reinforces the idea that evidence-based justice, though sometimes slow, remains one of the strongest tools for finding the truth. As we reach the end of this series, it is worth reflecting on the central message that remains: justice may take time, but carefully collected scientific evidence helped bring the truth to light. If you have followed this case with us through all 10 parts, thank you for watching. This story is not only a record of what happened, but also a reminder of the lessons we can learn from it. If you found this series helpful or informative, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss future videos. I would also like to hear your thoughts. Which lesson from this case resonated with you the most? Feel free to share your comments below. Thank you again for being part of this journey. Until the next case, take care and stay safe.